Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Man Talk podcast. Today, Jacob and I are back with new cameras and kind of new audio. We're going to talk about modern day issues and potential solutions to problems that we have faced in our own lives to what we think are the modern day issues that are facing us. So, Jacob, what was the motivation behind this podcast to begin with?
So, this is one of our subtopics that we've been going over just from our walks around Davis or going around town. And this kind of had like a 20 to 30 minute category every time, but it wasn't the biggest topic. It just kept creeping up in these 5 to 10 minute bites. So, we thought, well, this is something that keeps creeping up, so we should probably talk about some of why it keeps coming up and flush out the ideas to maybe do something about it. We're both in the engineering field. This seems like a good idea to, instead of talk about it for 20 to 30 minutes, let's consolidate it all into one podcast so we can just start getting at the solutions of it. And it was bothering me too, so that helped a lot for getting through this. So, yeah, that's
Yeah,
the start.
yep, basically. So, like, as a general overview, as everyone knows, society has changed a lot in the last 100 years. We went from basically not using any technology, including electricity, to having all of our lives fundamentally changed by innovations like the car, the um, computer, and in terms of the 21st century, the internet. But with all these technological advancements, there's been some debate amongst me and Jacob and the broader society, like, oh, what's happening to society as a whole? Is it healthy because of these technological advancements? Is how society transforming on the right path? What are some of the negative side effects of this? And some of the issues we brought up mainly stemmed from the social aspects, the lack of interpersonal connection with people, like in person interpersonal connection. Because yes, you can have your virtual connections, but they lack that physical touch that's hard to replicate. And we'll go on in a little bit why that's so. There's also the lack of cohesive friend networks that are physically next to each other. Again, for the previous reason, if everyone's diffused, spread out, it's hard to build like a coalition of people who are actually living within the same city. Because back in the day, when we had little towns and not a lot of car movement between town and town, most of your friends were people who you went to school with in elementary school or in high school, or possibly even university, depending on where you settled down. But again, once, at least in our experiences, Jacob could back this up, when we all graduated from university back in 2014, 2015, everybody dispersed from university and went back to their hometowns or their own way, their own places. And that loss of connection was kind of sudden and dramatic for a lot of us because we were living together more or less for the last 2 to 4 years, and then there's just no connection unless you count like a Facebook ping or something like that. But it's not quite the same. How would you characterize that change in connection from in person to internet, or basically virtual, Jacob?
Let's first get the boundary conditions. So, we're talking about general United States, but for us, we're really going to put the boundaries around the metropolis slash suburban environments in where we're at. So that's probably a good place to start because there's plenty of rural places still in the United States where they have had generations of people just staying in the same place. And that's just not the way they swing. But in a particularly progressive place like California, a metropolis environment with all these suburbs that are on the verge of it, where you have a dense amount of people, that's where you really start seeing the extreme effects. And that's where I would like to continue with what kind of problems that was arising. So, one of them being the connection which you mentioned. And then the second one, there is this, it's not like you had people that were there for generation after generation after generation. There's a lot of transplants. And what I mean by transplant is people who have not lived there for a long time, and they may not live there longer than 5, 10 years, then they're off to the next one. And a lot of the United States is behaving that way. We're going from metropolis to metropolis to metropolis on the hunt for the job. And the third thing being, you got this job network now that everyone's tied into, where all of a sudden, okay, I need to change jobs in 6 months. I'm going to Indeed. I'm going to LinkedIn. I'm messaging everyone I can that has a job that's somewhere in my area that I would like to work in. And it's more about, where do I set up shop for the next job anywhere in the country? I mean, I've heard a statistic of how 10% of the nation will have to move at some point within the next year. And that's a lot of mobility. That didn't used to be the case. Most people weren't interested in moving every year. Now, granted, it's different people moving every year. And there's different reasons for that, whether you work abroad, which is most of them, or you have to change your job because that metropolis sector doesn't cater to the job that you were working in, or it's tyrannical. So all of that is coming up to a head where, well, how do you want to keep living life moving forward? So that's how this came up for me. And I don't know if that answered the question quite right. What other parts of the question did you want me to answer?
Well, basically, from your perspective, the effect that this diffusion of people, you mentioned jobs, how everyone has to basically move to their job, and that job might not be stable, and they may, like you gave the example of the 10% of people have to move this year alone. It's kind of a lot of people. That's like 35 million people just bouncing around the United States trying to find their next gig. Um, but specific to our little social networks, how has this moving process, because you have to move yourself, right? And the psychological toll that's taken on you. I was wondering how that affected you and whether you personally enjoy it, or if not enjoy it, tolerate it. And if not tolerate it, deal with it. And if you don't, what your solution or alternative would be.
Okay, so in short, my experiences with moving and what I feel about it, my opinion on it, some experience.
Yes.
All right, I'll get started then. Let's go back to 2014, where this giant thing began. So everyone graduates, and everyone either has a job, which is maybe around 20 to 25% of the class, or 75% who are looking. Okay, this is the STEM fields. So people are still looking. That's not a big deal because half of them weren't even looking to begin with right off the bat. They just want to get through school. Okay, fine. Then you had people that were, look, we want to get something as soon as we get out of here because we're broke and we want to make sure we can get some income. We've got debt to pay off. We've got families to support, or we just want to get started on getting our life started. So in my case, I went over to North Dakota, which we've mentioned in some other podcasts, and that was a big sacrifice. And it wasn't just me. That was 4 other friends of mine that did it. If not 5 of friends of ours that did it. And we're going into the Midwest. We're going to Louisiana. We're going to New York. We're going all over the place. For me specifically, I went to Texas, Oklahoma, North Dakota, United Arab Emirates. That's a lot. And you don't know anyone anywhere you go except for the people that are working in your company. So that's kind of hard. So you're always in my name is so and so mode when you get to the next city. And
Yep.
that was really apparent when I got to work with, let's see here, 9 different frac crews. And there were 27 different shifts. So I dealt with 9 shifts, really. And more like 5 to 6 different frac crews. But it was a lot. It was a lot. And you've got to learn all these people's names. You got to figure out where they're coming from. You got to work on new clients and learn the new rules. You're just constantly learning. And you don't feel like someone's got your back all the time because you're always that new guy that's one mistake away from getting a bad reputation. And I think that is detestable, in my opinion. I hate that. I hate that feeling. I only tolerated it because that was the adventure. Um,
Right.
Once I got back to California the next year, I was okay to come back. It was good to have some friends that I had contact with, but it wasn't the same. And the main reason why it wasn't the same was we were on different missions. Some were going to university still, others were in a different social mission. And me, I was just in work mission. I wanted to get in the job and do well, and then chill when I come back home and just kind of take the rest of the year off for whatever days I had. It really wasn't about pushing myself in the social direction. Really just wanted
Right.
to kind of go a status quo. So, in short, I think moving a lot is harsh on your psychological health. It does provide some level of PTSD side effects if you're not always in a trusting environment. And as an introvert, you get your energy sucked a lot. So all that energy that you would normally have in reserve when you're dealing with people you trust is now being uh, lost due to all these new friendships and work partners you have to deal with. Granted, it doesn't always stay that way, but if you constantly move, there's a certain chance that it will. So
Yeah.
that's some opinions of mine on that.
Makes sense. For my experience specifically, I basically stayed in Davis post graduation. So I've seen the flight of all my friends from Davis to their respective work areas. So I basically experienced like an inverse version of that where I stayed, but everyone else left. And that creates its own isolating feel because you, meaning me, have to travel to all my friends if I want to see them in person, not just the virtual connection. I can speak with them online, but I know just how I write is a lot different than how I speak. Even though there's some analog, there's a loss in translation going on. And I much prefer to be able to speak on the fly than have to type and be limited by my typing speed. That does matter a lot, especially when I'm trying to get a point across. I can quickly rattle something off verbally, whereas with typing, I'm limited by just how fast I can type, and it changes what I'm going to say, which kind of bothers me because I'm more direct and frank when I'm verbally speaking because the other person can tell, oh, I'm not stewing on something for several hours just to get the right wording so that the other person uh, thinks better of whatever I'm saying. Whereas if I'm just talking, like right now, and it's coming out naturally, it's like, oh, okay, well, this isn't pre planned. He doesn't have like a script he's reading or anything. This is just his actual opinions on this. And especially if you have that in person touch, that benefits from um, whatever verbal skills you've developed throughout your life. So if you happen to be more on the witty side or you like to crack jokes, your timing works out better. And the other person appreciates that because, well, you're right there. And they're not just going to stare at you blankly, like, okay, and then move on to the next topic, unless you really weren't that funny. But that's pretty funny in and of itself. And if they just were like, okay, moving on.
Yeah. Yeah. Next question,
But
please.
yes. So it's like, well, I definitely don't prefer virtual reality when I'm talking with people because of that separation that you get. I prefer the in-person touch, and even when I'm communicating with people on the phone, whether it be video or just on telephone, it's not quite the same as when you're in person. It's that being able to read their body language or like physically when they're right next to you. Uh, I don't know. There's something about that just gives a lot different impression than if they're separated and then they can just feel comfy and at ease and just kind of vegetate it out.
You know, there was something in North Dakota with even the people that I did get to work with for at least a few months. There's some central nervous system stuff going on. You have something that's being identified in your brain that this is a good place to be, And you don't always get that with video and audio like what we're doing with the podcast. There is something in the way. It's called the screen, the camera, the distance, all that's still there. But when they're right next to you, there is a wiring that we're just so designed for. And it's really cool when it happens because you really do feel like you're not alone. You feel like there's some way that there's a common mission, at least in that moment. And it's really sweet. I really like it myself.
Yeah, the a word to describe that is like camaraderie, and it's hard to use camaraderie in the context of a virtual space unless you're doing like a massive, like a RuneScape type thing or an online like world. But even then, it's a much different feeling if you can physically see the person and enjoy that same um, successful or a sense of accomplishment.
Sure, and with gaming, it's kind of cool because you can't always do this kind of stuff in real life. So there is this new expansion you can go, but I don't think it's a primary need. It's a secondary. So if you're not getting your primary needs met, and you go off and do that exciting thing, yeah, it's fun for a while, but it loses its luster and appeal. So, and sometimes you don't want to do that as much anymore for the very reasons you're talking about. Um, so,
Right,
yeah.
you need to balance it.
So, and I'm glad that at least with us, like sometimes I'll go over into the western part of Sacramento and meet up with you, or sometimes you come over and over in the eastern side of Sacramento and hang out with me. That's been beneficial to me for the reasons we've been describing.
Right. Um, from what I've noticed in your, or from what I'm assuming, you can correct me if I'm wrong. In
Go
terms
ahead.
of your ability to focus on yourself and maintain some kind of personal development, it must be extremely difficult, if not just not a priority, if you're constantly moving and flying and always in transit in different aspects of your job. It's feels like personal development, personal growth mostly happens if you're relatively sedentary and can apply enough mental space to address it. Would you agree or disagree?
Mixed answer.
Yes.
So you grow as a human being in different ways when you get to stay in one place and develop outward. But I'd actually recommend the adventure approach when you're young because this is going to be your opportunity to see a different kind of growth. In this case, it's more about can you find yourself reliable when things are going to hell in a handbasket around you in a new place in a new environment? Can you handle that kind of stress? So, and with the sedentary approach where you're staying in one place, which was really what you're referring to, staying in one place and being able to maximize your network and help out people in your area and get to know them really well over like a 5 year stretch, that's different. That's the slow, incremental, slowly building the relationship. And I think that's cool too, and probably the primary. But if you don't get the adventure, I think there's a lot of ingratitude that you'd feel. For example, when I was a kid, I felt like where I grew up was kind of a prison. It didn't feel like home. It felt more like I can't wait to leave. And that was really apparent when I was an adolescent. But heck, once I got to adolescent, I'm going, I need to leave. I need to get my own destiny, do my own adventure, and find a new home where I can actually say, this is home. And what I was getting at like 15, 17 years old, I'm going, this is, if I stay here, it's going to be a prison and life's not going to go so well. So I need to get out there. The opportunity is elsewhere. So it's a mixed bag. And if you don't get any adventure, your lack of gratitude may show up if you stay in one place. But that's just me. Some people do awesome by staying in one place. And our ancestors would probably say something similar. Oh, I've lived in this farm town forever and I don't want to leave it because this is where all my meaning of life is. This is where I've been able to develop the most. That street corner is where I met so and so. That place, that movie theater is where I was able to bond over some friends over this movie that was just so awesome, and we got to hang out after. So it's different for people, but I would recommend the adventure so you have the memory of a contrast. Oh, that's right. I remember when all of my friends were gone and I had to rely on myself to get back home. I had to work at a really hard job and I had to deal with being by myself in a harsh environment and getting through it to the end. And then when you're back home and you're able to develop those friendships again and recultivate, like what happened with me, and I recultivated some of those friendships, it was thank God I'm not in that adventure anymore, but I'm so glad I have the contrast because it spurs gratitude.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point actually, because most of your adventuring would take place in your early 20s, post college. That age zone from 22 to about the time you settle down and have a family. And just drawing parallels to back in the day where you're growing up in your little village or town and there's not much going on, the only sense of adventure would be to go out and go to the big city, maybe go out on a voyage, like a literal voyage out to the Orient or something, and then go on a literal adventure that takes you around the world, which some people do nowadays. But in contrast, because of the internet and all that other stuff, you don't actually have to leave necessarily from the comfort of your room, because the adventure could be like in video games, for example, or just knowing people in different countries and Skyping with them and talking with them there and like, oh yeah, live vicariously through them. But yeah, I guess for the 21st century, physically needing to travel to that place isn't as paramount as it would be like in the 1600s or 1700s, where there wasn't technology that could just teleport you there with a visual like aid
That's a
to the.
great point you talked about with the physical voyage. So, long airplane flights are one thing, but if you have to be on a boat for 2 months and you're stuck with these people that are all going to the new world, for example, that's a totally different experience. And you'll never forget that the rest of your life. Your food source is very limited. You are confined on this boat or ship all the way over on sails, going through storms, and maybe even getting lost. That's tough. So the journey does change you. I think if there's anything to take away from the doing the adventure, the journey changes you, but there's an extreme case where you don't want to adventure to the point where it changes you beyond help. So what I mean by that is it affects your character in a negative way to where it's permanent. And then you've got so much PTSD from moving around and not trusting anybody and always being in a new place that you're permanently distrusting of society and you'll just continue to move because that's just what you do. That's how some people live. And you see that in the oil industry. You see that in if you're in a security agency or you're helping out with going overseas and if you did a lot of deployments, there's a lot of jobs I could think of where you're moving all the time. That's why they have a rotation system because they understand, look, everyone's got a life. They don't want to put their whole life into it except for that extreme sliver of people which they like, but they understand that's not who they're catering to. They're going to cater to the broad public. And they want to do a rotation, maybe one deployment or two, maybe a few 2 weeks on and one off rotations, but not their whole life. So that's how it can work: is that you have a rotation of people in and out.
Speaking of family, because the rotation aspect's mostly geared towards those who have more connected roots and they get exhausted if they're just traveling all the time, being apart from their loved ones. For the modern day family, why, at least this is the impression I get, I think you're on the same page. Why is it not as much of a priority in our day to day lives? Because even in the 70s, when, computers weren't really full force into society, even in the 70s, uh, most families were beginning in their early 20s, like 21, 22, 23. But nowadays, at least in California, you'd be hard pressed to find a lot of families that are beginning before 28, 29, 30. So, at least in your experience or in your opinion, why is this the case, and what are some of the side effects that could be causing this issue to worsen with the lack of the modern family, the connective tissue keeping them together?
I think it's still there. It's just it's delayed heavily. And that's not necessarily good because if it delays indefinitely, it may just never happen. So let's say, and let's talk about what we already did before. So we know that people are moving a lot for jobs. We know we're not seeing people always staying in the same city. Okay, those two right there are already breaking apart a lot of deep relationships. We're talking about more on the mile wide, inch deep than on the other way around. But the other problem is we've decided as a society that the individual matters a lot. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's to the point where the family or just the unit of society that keeps making people in the United States the way it is, that could turn tyrannical and more of a the individual will always win in the sense that the family will always take a back seat to it, which is not how the family works. The family works where there is a hierarchy of you got the kids, you got the parents, and then the extended family that all works together to try and get the kids raised, to get the adults paid, and maintain their households. That has been delayed by a lot of things. One of them being college debt. College debt, I mean, that even for STEM field people, that delays you 5 years, easy. If you had to take on 100% of the debt in order to get through school, at least in chemical engineering, you're looking at about 5 years to get rid of it. Problem with college debt is it's also like indentured servitude, where you can't, and this is quoting from some people who've been on the podcast, you can't get rid of that. That's it, you have to pay off that debt or it just stays with you. You can't declare bankruptcy on it in the United States. So that's really important because let's say you're not in the STEM fields. That could take you 10 years to pay off. Well, are you going to start a family with a debt? How does that look if you're trying to find a partner and they notice you've got $150,000 of debt and you're not so interested in paying it off? That's a big negative, especially for a guy. If a guy has debt and a gal's looking at him, I'll find someone who doesn't have that much problems with their finances. I'll go with somebody else. And then they just get sidestepped. That's a big deal. And I'm very fortunate that that isn't my problem with the debt. It's more of the moving. That's been more of my problem and the off shift work, which that's temporary. That's different. Debt is something that could take years to actually just get over. And then what about the house? Every family wants a house in the United States, or at least most of them do, or they one day aspire to have it but never get it or rent one. If you can't save up for a house, that's another 5, 10 plus years. That's a long time. So
I guess a way of articulating your thoughts alternatively is there's a lot of economic pressures going on in the 21st century that maybe Americans didn't have to face as much in the 50s, 60s, maybe the early 70s. And because of those economic pressures, they're really changing the fundamental fabric of how humans interact in American society. Because based off of my uh, understanding of other societies where the economics are a lot cheaper just to live, to own a home, to have a family, it's a lot cheaper than it is, especially in California, which is one of the most expensive places to live at the moment in the US.
so
And because
yeah.
and because of those economic pressures, everyone's basically pushing off their family and their ability to raise kids and save uh, because it's just not financially responsible in their minds or feasible in their minds in right out of college or up until their early 30s to start a family.
So we covered a lot of the economic things that have significantly delayed people getting into a family situation. What do you think about the social things, which can be independent from economic? Let's start there. What independent social changes do you think have changed the family dynamic, Julian?
So, if we elaborate on the individuality costs perspective, essentially with hyper individuality, you have the notion that the individual is the pinnacle of your existence, and well, essentially, all other aspects of society need to adhere to whatever the individual wants. So that can manifest itself as, oh, I'm just going to buy stuff that makes me happy and contribute to society in ways that only make me happy at the detriment to everybody else around me. You can kind of see this with extreme versions of Wall Street marketing or investing, where they're just placing bets or hedging bets that only really benefit themselves and they get a bigger cut of the pie at the detriment of, well, yeah, at the detriment of the rest of society. And then more at the individual level, where it's just socially how people interacting with each other. They may not prioritize their social relationships as high priority, meaning, oh, they may see like dating as more trivial, like, oh, you could just date someone else. That connection I had with that person wasn't the connection I was looking for. And then you can just find a new person to try to connect with, even though possibly after the 100th person, you're like, oh, okay, what's going on? Why can't I connect with any of these people? You know, do am I too like, is society delivering everything to me in such a way where I'm too specific with what my needs are and I don't have any discernible like average taste, let's say, meaning like, oh, I need to have a guy who is 6'5" or something as trivial as that. And it's like, oh, if we look at the height statistics, it's like, oh, that's only 2% of the population. Are you just going to discount the other 98% of guys because of a personal preference? What about personality and all that stuff? Um, Stuff as trivial as that, all the way to, oh, I could just buy all the stuff that can make me, the individual, happy. Like I have my streaming services, I have my gym membership, I have my travel where I can travel alone or with some close friends. But was that, how does that give back to society? Usually not very much, unless you're the kind of person who volunteers or specifically works in a field that is paid to give back to society, like in education or healthcare or something along those lines. But I guess from my perspective, it just our market forces, the way our economics is set up, really pushes you to go full force into prioritizing yourself. And most people just buy into that without second guessing it. But it does come at a cost, and your cost is, that social network. And people don't probably want to admit this, but certain friends you can't pay the cost because they're not of the same social or rather same economic hierarchy. Like they don't make as much. They can get excluded just because they're more impoverished and the other group knows that they can't afford it. And it's like, oh, okay, we're just broadening out the class hierarchy, um, which as you age and you enter different echelons of what your well what your tastes are, what you think is fun. It's like, oh, even the trip down the street to like some expensive bar could be you could be priced out of that, so you can't participate in that friend group anymore.
So the economic forces really do play into the social. But you did.
I think so. Yes, I think so. It's probably, arguably, at least pondering on it since we've discussed this last time. It really does seem like there, especially in California, the economic forces are so strong that it's changing the way people are interacting with each other.
I would say there are some independent ones though, and the independent one, and this is coming not necessarily from the internet, but it can, is there is no benefit. I mean the and I mean social benefit. Like you don't win a particular social benefit for trying to, let's say, have a family early. Your all your other friends don't have to do that anymore. That is no longer taboo. Well, if that's no longer socially taboo, okay, then we'll just save up. Everyone else is in the same boat, and you can play this game a lot. You can play this game almost indefinitely. Oh, I'm saving for a house, or well, I'm not quite ready, or I'm gonna probably have to move again in the next couple of years, and before you know it, you could stay in that group indefinitely. Which before you couldn't. There really was a social push to you need to get through high school. You need to get your credentials in order to work. You need to go get a job, and then as soon as you're able to have a stable job, get your family in order and get going. Which there really isn't that push, and I'm actually surprised the patience of our people today that are older about it, because a generation ago they would have been saying, start, what are you doing with your life? This is where a lot of your meaning is. Work has no place in this joy of your life. It really should be more about the family. Work's really just a means to get economically stable. And so the way the value has been put has been, and since the taboo no longer matters about you need to have a family as soon as possible, well, then now you don't have to. The motivation and the social benefit of starting early, it just isn't there. It's everything negative. And we keep hearing about if you get married early, there's a high likelihood of getting divorced. If you married early and you have too many kids, you're going to be broke the rest of your life. You keep getting these messages. And I think those are not independent. I think they are dependent on the technology. Not necessarily the economics, but the technology is definitely sending that message. You are disposable. Take as much as you possibly can so that way you can save up for a house. Don't worry about having a family. The environment could use not having another kid on the planet. The kid that you will have will create more trash than anything else you will do in your life combined. You send enough messages like that through social media and through what else we're getting our information from. People just go, okay, well then I'm good as I am, and I'll save for my house, and then I'll hang out with my friends and call it a day. So it's weird, right?
Yeah, the change in tone from pro humanity to what basically amounts to anti humanity. Like, oh, don't engage in what all of our ancestors have basically engaged in since the beginning of time, which is, family network. Oh, don't, have social networks that basically amount to anything that could be construed as unproductive, right, to the broader fabric of society. And just prioritize yourself beyond everything else. It's a little, well, it's soul crushing in a sense, because it's like, say you're not a big fan of yourself, right? And you're very critical and you're more on the mindset like, oh, if I wasn't here, then it wouldn't even affect the planet, right? The planet would be happy to not see me here because then I wouldn't be contributing to global warming. I wouldn't be contributing to the giant trash gyres in the ocean. I wouldn't be doing XYZ. But it's like that reverse status of humans just existing in general that's created a lot of negative impressions on the individual. So not only are they just acting their own interests, they probably also have this weird sense of self-loathing and hatred that just makes them want to consume more and try to forget of all the problems that are happening in the world. It's kind of an insidious cycle that, if left unanalyzed, you just get really depressed and demotivated.
That's why we are analyzing it, because it's not going to be something that we want to have this insidious thing under the surface forever. This is something we want to tackle. That's the whole point of today. So, with that considered, have you thought about some of the things we could do to not necessarily change the tide uh, on the whole, but maybe something we can do local, like you and me, or within our friend group?
So yeah, what we're doing right now is an extension of what other people could be doing as well. Is just having open dialogue about topics other than, I guess, stuff that's lighthearted or superficial, let's say.
Marvel movies. Say it. Say it,
Yeah.
Julian.
Yeah, I mean, you can analyze Marvel movies to death, but you can also just talk about the issues facing our current generation and what potential solutions we have and the processes you would go about to solving them. For example, people are very concerned about CO2 levels in the atmosphere. Rather than just stopping oil production cold turkey and hoping for the best, which is like a hard brake on a freeway, you're going to
Yeah.
skid a bit before you actually stop, right? How about we find incremental improvements or otherwise address global warming on many sides or CO2 production on many sides so that we have our sciences, our academy trying to fix CO2 so that it's pulled out of the atmosphere, sequestered. We have alternative means of producing energy, so we're not focusing on coal, like say nuclear power, specifically fourth generation, or creating new types of alternative fuel cells like hydrogen that's gathered through solar panels or wind energy, or just basically anything that's, oh, we have to stop cold turkey because otherwise the planet's going to blow up in 12 years. That mindset is very pessimistic, for one, and does not motivate people to find a solution. And two, is very simplistic because it doesn't attack the problem with the necessary multi-pronged approach that you would expect from a multifaceted solution, right? Similarly, in our day-to-day lives, it would be great if each individual reached out to those who are in their community or at their workplace or anywhere in between and just started to talk to them about more than just Marvel movies and started to get to more meaningful discussions. It's not easy, especially if the person's not very interested, but that's where it gets a little dicey because, oh, how do you solve that? Technology. You find the groups of people who are motivated enough to discuss those topics and you convene with them. And they may be diffuse across the world or the state or the country or a city. And the only way for collaboration is with technology. So it's kind of like, oh, how do we build connectivity and more meaningful discussions if you're lacking that in your real world life? Well, you can move to where those people are, or you can connect with those people with technology. It's kind of this double-edged sword, you know.
Technology's neutral. It's how you use it. And I gotta say, it can be used insidiously, and it could also be used positively. And in the case of insidious, it's weird. Like the way I use social media back in, let's say, 2015 versus now. The way I was using it before was I'd actually have the Facebook app on my phone, except instead of just having the messenger. That's insidious because what that does is any ounce of time that I could have just spent doing something else for 5 minutes, now I want to press that button and just scroll. Well, that's not really that helpful. and it actually devalues what the people were trying to post about, in some regard, unless you actually appreciate it. But chances are, the way that exercise is performed, not so much. Um,
Yeah, that appreciation amounts to temporary distraction that you will soon forget.
Unless it's something really important, which is one reason why I've noticed Facebook started to do like they started to put out messages on your email if it's something that you might want to look at, which I thought was interesting. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes they're flat out wrong. So they're still working with it. Um,
Yeah, tweaking their algorithms to try to get the best outcome for their users.
so we've got technology and we've got alternative energy talk, and I understand the alternative energy. I can't wait until we've got a day where it's just as easy as you take the sunlight and for every city or whatever, they just boil water and the steam engine goes and we have power. But we're not there yet. And we, yeah, turning over the infrastructure, to your point, you can't just stop everything. You can't. Even if we believed 100% that the environmentalists are right. Stop everything. People are going to die. People need to drive places. People need to go to work. They need to provide services. You can't just stop everything. The impact of that would probably leave an environmental devastation that would be beyond what we can imagine, because now people are going to innately break the law to use energy devices, and because our efficiency would probably drop so low because people will be forced to use that kind of law of don't use any fossil fuels, you're looking at chaos here just waiting to happen. It's a great way of putting your idealism out there. It's just it's naive and it doesn't work.
Yeah, you have to be pragmatism goes a long way towards resolving problems or just taking an approach and then breaking it down into smaller bite-sized things that you can actually address instead of like hair on fire, the world's going to end, there's no solution, nihilism,
And that's
right?
stupid too, because when they talk about that, that's not opening up the dialogue. That's
Right.
okay. So what did you want me to do specifically? Change the world. Okay. How do you want me to change the world? Right now. No. How specific? Okay. Fine. Look, just go back, and then I'll drive my car less once a week or something, or I'll continue to turn my lights off when I'm not using them. So how am I supposed to change? You need to be as motivated as I am politically. Okay. No, not going to happen. Um,
Right.
how
And
dare you?
on that note specifically, going forward into the 2020s and beyond for the 21st century, because the whole fabric of society has kind of changed away from a more religious morals mindset. There could be some socially guided updating of, oh, this is how you're supposed to act in society. That's not necessarily driven by political dogma or religious dogma, but is more of a neutral, like, oh, this is your baseline standard for social interaction. Because, yes, in the US, you have a bunch of different religions and then a bunch of different political temperaments, and you can't just coerce and force people to abide by them. So you have to have this baseline level of decorum where fundamentally different people can interact with each other. And I think that system's already in place. We just have to ensure that all of us follow it and don't chop each other's heads off when someone doesn't do something to one's liking, especially if the political dogma. The worst thing you could have is to adopt politics as your religious sentiments, meaning that you just believe in a position without any sort of foundational basis that guides it and is unadaptable, unmalleable. You have to have a little bit of malleability in what you believe, politically speaking, because as with anything in politics, it's subject to change. There's an asterisk there in your political opinions, like, oh, but what about this circumstance where this policy might make sense? Um, you can't just abide by it thoughtlessly, let's say.
thoughtlessly, and with no boundary conditions or if then statements to correct the protocol, what good is it? And then people are just going to do whatever they want, and then they'll say, well, it doesn't work. We need something that's pragmatic and it can bring people together. And as far as the religion criteria, I would argue that that is one of the problems of today. If you don't value, let's say, Jesus, for example, if you don't value that there is some higher power that is completely dominating everything in the universe, that will change your mindset to think that you can, or that it doesn't matter, or people aren't, there isn't this, your life doesn't count, the nihilism thing, or any of that. And that's problematic because that's going to treat the way you treat your neighbor. And that, to me, is a it's a disgrace in a way, because you can't treat them, you can't necessarily treat them right. And that's something I've been trying to work on, is can I take care of the people within my working and social environment where they walk away better, instead of, okay, I just hung out with them for the moment, but then I go away and I wasn't inspired, or I wasn't helped, or I felt encouraged. Um, that's something that I think that it would be a good thing to strive for individually.
Yeah, being a role model for the future. If everyone acted in such a way where they thought about, oh, is what I'm doing right now role model material for someone else? Whether it be someone at your equal playing field, like your level, maybe someone even older, but especially for the next generation, just a baseline template of, oh, this person's always very helpful, always very kind, always very polite, and goes out of their way for XYZ reason to help those around their circle, just like a mentorship would do. Does that model encourage people to also follow and adopt that model? I would argue yes, if it's robust enough and the people are genuinely changed by the coaching that you would get, then sure. Or genuinely changed by, oh, this person's very bright and wise. I want to mimic them and eventually become them in a sense, become their actions, let's say. Um,
Integration. I want to
yes,
integrate that part of them that seems to make the world better with me.
right. Because obviously you can do the reverse. Your model could be the one of, oh, I'm just going to take everything for myself and be the last man standing. That would be a very detrimental model because if everybody's clawing their way to the top, then and one person gets to the top, well, where's the other 350 million people? Like, you can't just keep stepping on everybody and expecting you, the one in 350 million, to get to the top. It's not very practical. And once you thrown yourself, for example, what are you gonna do? You already defeated everybody else. You're just gonna sit there all alone, and without the little network that you could reap the benefits if everyone rose up together.
Yeah, you'll suffer and die. That's what'll happen, just like everybody else. But the difference is, if we actually work together, we'll have a way where people will suffer and die, but not all at once. And we can actually build something for people that are coming into the world and for people leaving it. That seems like way more helpful, because we already have enough unnecessary suffering to begin with. If we could just take some of that off of people's shoulders and allow them to, oh, wow, the burden I was carrying yesterday, because of what we talked about today, I feel 5% better. Well, that 5% is going somewhere. That's going to accrue somewhere. It's helping somebody. So,
Right. And then on top of that, another thing people can do is not tread the path of least resistance all the time because of either fear or anxiety or whatever may beset you. Instead, if you have an obstacle, you can either brute force your way over it, which only work so much, or check your ego and ask for help, which, if everybody's ego is only getting bigger and bigger as we go into the 21st century, might be a little challenging to accomplish. So, remembering that, yes, you're only human, you're not augmented yet to be some kind of superhuman cyborg. Um, you're not going to accomplish and solve problems as quickly or as fast as everybody else in the world. Some will be quicker, some will be slower. But more importantly, if everybody collaborates together, then we have what we just talked about, that synergetic like rise up as a group.
Seems a lot better because there'll be some people along the way that think, nah, we're going to burn the world to the ground. And if you've got some people that say, I don't think so, we can actually keep those people from just, well, having a world full of suffering and death only. It'd be nice to have something other than that. So, yeah, groups would be good. Groups of good people would be good. Groups of good skilled people and would be preferred.
Groups of people who have a common goal in mind outside of work, because obviously work you're paid to have the common goal, but something larger than individual, which coincidentally enough, in most cases, if you're working in as a part in a larger machine, you'll probably feel a positive feedback loop once you reap the benefits of whatever you're contributing to. A lot of people don't necessarily love the fact that they're getting all this money, but they're not getting a transaction in value, meaning of individual worth, self worth, individual value. It's like, oh, well, that's why a lot of folks, or a good amount of folks, go into selfless endeavors that may not necessarily pay that much in terms of dollars and cents, but the return on personal gratification in terms of contributing to society pays off 5, 10, 100-fold. Something you can't quantify with a dollar bill, you know?
There are more types of revenue than just money. Well
Yes.
said.
Yep.
So, what other concluding things we could do for all this, Julian? We're nearing the end here, but maybe we can summarize a little bit of all of these pieces so we can move forward from there.
Sure. Well, as I see it, essentially society is going to progress forward with all of its technology, automation, economic woes, whether we're prepared for it or not. But knowing that is half the battle. And then if you're able to navigate it properly with a little bit of foresight and whatnot, you can try to either tread water, swim miles ahead of everybody, or just suffer in misery. It's a matter of perception at that point, right? Because it's like, well, the tools are still in your hands, in your control, and I guess the best creative among us will figure out solutions that will work best for us. But because of that individualization that has progressed since, say, the 50s, where each one of us can literally live our life however we please, apart from a family or a society, in our virtual networks, what have you. Um, each one of us is kind of like a culture of, oh, this works, this doesn't work for our given time. Because the advice we're giving now may not apply in 10 years. Society could be radically changed again towards some kind of hyper new technology. For all we know, we may not even be driving that much because of self driving cars, for example, and how that's going to change a whole sector of the economy. But I guess what I would do to keep at least afloat is be mindful of all of this. Do the tried and true stuff that hasn't really changed in the last 100 years, i.e., like have your social networks, try to keep them interpersonal as possible, And remember that for some of your issues, it does take a village. For other issues you may have, well, you have to have the grit developed from your call to adventure that you hopefully undertook right out of college, um, to face the new challenges coming up in the next decades. Um, and every day is an opportunity to build your talent stack, to learn new skills, and to try out new opportunities that may present themselves to you. And I guess my ultimate advice to try to beat back the woes of modernity is to always be learning new strategies, new avenues of attack, so that you don't fall behind and get succumb basically to, well, to your worst nightmares.
But by the way, there are worse nightmares than your worst nightmares. So it's
Yes.
good to be cognizant of that. Um, I'm glad we got to do this, Julian. This has been one of those things it really has popped up a lot, but it was coming out in waves. So maybe a 5 minute uh, sound bite there, 10-minute dialogue there, but now it's great to have something where we dialed in on this is what's going on. This is the awareness that we need to be cognizant of what's happening around us, and the start of the new direction and finding a way to bypass the damage and come up with solutions that are going to work. And I'm really glad that we've had technology to help us out with that. I'm really looking forward to it getting better. The internet getting faster and faster and faster is going to help a lot. Uh, Being able to be more competent in our craft will allow us to be more economically favorable so we can stay in a place that makes sense and be able to maintain that network. So, with that said, Mr. Julian, if you had any other closing thoughts, that was it for me. I'm about ready.
Yeah, I'm good too. Pretty solid.
Pretty solid. Thanks everyone for watching.